Welcome back to the Judgment Infrastructure podcast. In episode 1, we examine why podcasts fail. In episode 2, we analyze why monetization often corrupts authority. Today we shift perspective. Today's question: what is a podcast structurally? Most people think it is audio content. It is not. When engineered properly, a podcast becomes a digital twin of your mind. Let's apply the 2080 rule. Part 1. What most people see. Most people see podcasting as a marketing channel, a content distribution platform, a brand visibility tool, a way to build audience. There is surface level interpretation, useful but incomplete. We must go deeper. Part 2. The critical 20%. Here is the structural 20%. A podcast is a system for documenting your thinking architecture. Not your opinion, your architecture. The way you diagnose problem, the way you extract principle, the way you structure decisions. If you repeat your framework consistently, your podcast becomes searchable cognition. A searchable cognition becomes intellectual infrastructure. Part 3. 5 Why Structural Diagnosis. Let's apply 5 Why. Why 1. Why do most podcasts feel repetition over time? Because hosts run out of new ideas. Why 2. Why do they run out of ideas? Because they rely on topics, not framework. Why 3. Why do they rely on topic? Because they never define their thinking system. Why 4. Why was there no thinking system defined? Because the goal was content production, not doctrine documentation. Why 5. Why was doctrine not documented? Because the host never viewed podcasting as architecture. That is the root. Part 4. What is the digital twin? In engineering, a digital twin is a virtual model that mirrors a physical system. It allows monitoring, optimization, simulation, refinement. Now apply that concept to thinking. If your podcast indexes your frameworks, documents your vocabulary, repeat your principle, connects episodes structurally, it becomes a digital twin of your intellectual system, not just expression, architecture. Part 5. Topic versus architecture. Topics are temporary. Architecture is durable. If you speak about trends, you achieve age quickly. If you speak about structural drivers, you achieve a compounds in value. The difference, opinion decays, frameworks endure. Part 6. The 2080 application. The 20% that determine 80% of the long-term authority. Structure repetition. Framework naming. Consistent vocabulary. Cross-episode reference. When you say, as we defined in episode 2, you are building interconnection. Interconnection builds system density. System density builds authority gravity. Part 7. Governance implication. If you treat podcasting casually, you produce scatter recording. If you treat podcasting architecturally, you produce an index doctrine. Every episode must answer, what framework does this reinforce? If the answer is unclear, you are speaking, not building. Part 8. The compounding effect. Here is how compounding works. Episode 1. Introduce principle. Episode 2. Reinforce it in new context. Episode 3 connects both to larger model. Now the listener sees structure. By episode 20, they are not following a show. They are learning a system. And system create loyalty, not personality. Part 9. Documentation versus performance. Performance fades. Documentation accumulates. A well-structured podcast achieved can become book chapter, become course module, becomes onboarding materials, become governance reference. Your thinking become transferable. Transferable thinking become leverage. Leverage become legacy. Part 10. Long-term strategic framing. If you design your podcast as a digital twin, year 1, you clarify your own thinking. Year 2, your audience internalize your framework. Year 3, your doctrine becomes reference standard. But if you design your podcast as content, year 1, you speak frequently. Year 2, you repeat loosely. Year 3, you drift. Architect prevents drift. Part 11. Practical implementation. If you want to build a digital twin, first, transcribe every episode. Second, extract recurring vocabulary. Third, tag framework consistently. Fourth, build cross-reference. And fifth, convert cluster into structured document. Audio is the raw layer. Indexing is a structural index layer. Documentation is the infrastructure layer. Closing principle. Most people use podcasts to express themselves. Few use podcasts to systemize themselves. If you record casually, your archive becomes noise. If you record structurally, your archive becomes architecture. Architecture outlives performance. Podcast is not media. It is the documentation of cognition. Next week, we will examine from episode to movement, building a podcast ecosystem. Until then, think before recording, structure before publishing, index before expanding. This is the Judgment Infrastructure Podcast. Correction from previous achieved is archived.